Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Detroiters Speak. We're going to get settled in 1 second. Over, and I'll be facilitating the discussion today. Tonight's topic is a timely one, as we'll get to in a second, is globalization and the logistics of workers' power. I don't know how many of you saw this, but we'll be talking to someone today that was a part of kind of like a nationwide effort of workers to walk out of their jobs at Amazon today, I believe in New York as well as in Maryland. And this has been part of a coordinated effort, really from kind of people who are organizing from the ground up. I think that's important because in the context of this series, we've been talking about various different approaches to the formal labor movement, but also towards gaining workers' power. And those aren't necessarily the same things as we've kind of addressed. Right? People have been dealing with kind of like the bureaucratization of the union movement itself and been seeking ways to have established workers' movements, similar to the workers' movement that General Baker himself was a part of in the plants at Chrysler, Dodge, Maine, right? When the kind of union bureaucracy wasn't taking care of black workers at the point of production on the shop floor, took their interest into their own hands. And that's really what we see happening with Amazon today. And we might be able to juxtapose it with probably a campaign that some of you might be more familiar with. And that was an effort to certify a union in Bessemer, Alabama, last year. And this kind of gets at some of the different tactics and strategies that people are trying to test and utilize. And we'll talk a bit about that today. We'll also talk about the importance of logistics. It's not only a point of production, but a point of distribution, right? And why that's so important to organize. You can see this kind of in some of the discussions that are active during COVID with supply chains or with the war in supply chains, right? And how disruptive that could be to the not only American economy, but the global economy. All right, so let me introduce our guests so I don't blabber on anymore. We have Abayomi Ezekwe, who is the founder and editor of the Pan-African Newswire. His writings and citations of work appear in numerous publications. I had pulled up a larger so let me give you your just desserts, please. Abayomi is the editor of Pan-African Newswire, an electronic press agency that was founded in 1998. He has worked for decades in solidarity with the liberation movements and progressive governments on the African continent and the Caribbean. Ezekwe is a graduate of Wayne State University in Detroit, where he earned undergraduate and graduate degrees in political science, public administration, and educational and administrative studies. He is the co-founder of several Detroit area organizations, including the Detroit Coalition Against Police Brutality, the Michigan Emergency Committee Against War and Injustice, and Moratorium Now, the Moratorium Now Coalition to stop foreclosures, evictions, and utility shutouts. Am I missing anything? No. Okay. All right. And then joining us via Zoom is Jonathan Bailey, who, as I mentioned, is one of the co-founders of Amazonians United, who kind of organized this walkout today, and has been a part of this kind of like really, we've been talking about kind of the burgeoning kind of grassroots labor movement that's kind of occurring all across this country, not only in the unionized positions or formal unions, but also just amongst rank and file solidarity and middle class and self-activity that has really developed during these last couple of years. Jonathan, I don't have much more information, but I'm hoping you could fill us in. I will say this: he has been, as part of his efforts, I've done a little bit of reading here. As part of his efforts, he's been, as you can imagine, harassed terribly by his employers, who have tried to stop the efforts of him and his comrades, not only in New York, but also in Chicago and elsewhere. And I believe he was detained and questioned by warehouse security for an extended period of time as an effort to intimidate him. And I think today is a good example of Jonathan's unwillingness to be intimidated, and he should be applauded for coming through and being here today to lead the struggle. So we applaud you.
It's very sweet of you.
Oh, go. I'll get you in a minute. We get one more. Vicente Duran. Vicente grew up between Southwest Detroit and Santiago, Chile, the son of a Detroit public school teacher and South American folk singer. Returning to Chile in 1996, he joined the organizations attempting to build a vision for revolutionary transformations under the neoliberal system created by Pinochet. He founded a hip-hop popular education collective called Hip Hop Logica and became an influential rapper himself, chronicling the struggles of the working class and Mapuche indigenous people. His work as an interpreter for home workers worldwide allowed him to visit women's workers collectives in Turkey, Romania, and Chile, as well as exchanges with the landless movement in Brazil and the unions fighting to control the water supply in Cochabamba. Came close. Bolivia. He currently has two equally demanding jobs: medical interpreter and chauffeur for his kids, and I share that latter position. Anyhow, let's welcome our guests if we could. All right, we're going to start off like this. We're going to have a couple of questions just to kind of ground our discussion for later. I'd like to have open discussion with this. So I'll have somebody talk, but if you guys want to respond to each other, that'd be great. And then from there, you'll each have your time to talk about your given activities and interests. So the first question is, what is globalization and how has it impacted workers? And Jonathan, why don't we, just for technological reasons, we could start with you. Are you cool with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the effective, this is a question that we talk a lot about within the movement at Amazon, because obviously Amazon is changing the way that capital flows across the world. It's changing some of the ways that we think about colonialism, and I think never before has it been like so important to like be able to look at colonialism in kind of the framework that Huey Newton like put forward when talking about a communalism that is like international. When we look at our ability to liberate ourselves from colonialism on the community level and attaching that to a pursuit of internationalism. For us, like in Amazon, actually, particularly here in New York, here in Western Queens, we can see a collection of Amazon focusing its warehouses close to like public housing, where a lot of where a lot of Black folks in New York are also like concentrated. And when you look across the world, you can see like Amazon targeting impoverished communities to be its labor pool. Like you can see that that Amazon has like a very clear sense for the way that people are colonized, not just on like the level of like a nation state, but really honestly on the level of communities. And furthermore, we also see how Amazon recognizes that that it can profit not just from colonialism that is like happening outside of the warehouse, right? In the form of supplying policing technology, in in supplying technology to the Department of Homeland Security, or like partnering with surveillance with like surveillance operations, but also like Amazon like fully embraces that like that view of the world in the way that, and it demonstrates it by hiring the ex-NSA chief to come in and take part in like operations of surveillance on workers, and doing things like hiring ex-FBI officers to be able to interrogate workers. We can see that Amazon recognizes an ability to exploit and oppress us, not just inside the warehouse, but also outside in our communities as well. And so with that kind of framework, we can see like an increased need to find ways in which we can seek liberation from colonialism within our actual like workplaces as unions, as well as like attaching it to our like community efforts, and further broadening it out to a focus of internationalism that unites us across the world as a global logistics chain.
Thank you, Justin. Here's Elliot.
Well, thank you. First of all, I want to acknowledge the invitation by the General Baker Institute and the other sponsors of the program. This is the third time I've spoken over here. The other two times it was outside because the weather was really nice, and it's getting nice again. The other two times we spoke on imperialism, and then before that on the housing crisis. All of these issues are interrelated. When we talk about globalization, it is a relatively new term, but it is a concept that goes back many, many, many years, centuries, even millenniums. If you think about world systems, for example, there's a world capitalist system today. There's countries that have a socialist orientation. But prior to, let's say, the 15th century, the world system was not centered on North America and Western Europe as it is today. There was what was called the Indian Ocean Basin, which brought together countries from East Africa through West Asia, what today is considered the Middle East, through the Asian continent, all the way down to Southern Asia. This was the principal center of world economic activity. Of course, that changed with the advent of the Atlantic slave trade and the rise of colonialism, and today neocolonialism. So it's not a new concept. You know, if we look at history and economic history of the world, and of course, being here at the General Baker Institute, we know that Detroit has been a center of what we consider globalization for many, many, many years. The development of the various industries, whether it's shipping, copper, timber, and later on the auto industry and steel industry linked the city of Detroit with the entire world. It attracted people from all over the world. So this is an ongoing process. Today, with the restructuring of the world system, it is done in a fashion in which workers are becoming even more exploited and oppressed, becoming much more difficult for workers to organize in the environment under which we live today. And this is clearly illustrated as well in the struggles that I've been supportive of, and that's the Fight for 15 movement, which has been in existence now for possibly 8 years. And also the struggles around the Amazon recognition, and also the independent organizing that has gone on in Amazon. I mean, the fact that people in most cases are not represented by any type of organized labor organization, but they have been able to shut down production, walk off the job, and also make some changes, limited changes in the way in which they do their work. So this is very, very important. And this, of course, draws on the legacy of Detroit in regard to Wildcat strikes, which, existed, we know as far back as the 1950s, and of course, we can go all the way back to the 1930s. But the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement consolidated this position out of what's known as Wildcat strikes, where workers took their own independent action to shut down production. And it had a tremendous impact not only on the working class movement in this country, but also the way in which capital looks at the production process, which necessitated them to make radical changes during the 1970s and 1980s. So this is an ongoing struggle, and we're all involved in it, whether you belong to a union or whether you don't belong to a union. It's becoming more and more difficult to exist. Look at the gas prices that are going up, food prices that are going up. Hyperinflation is very much a reality, worse than it has been in over 4 decades. We have a war now in Eastern Europe, which was initiated, by NATO and Washington, and we're going to have to pay for that war, because it's just going to disrupt even more supply chains, and it's going to require even more exploitation of working people. Thank you.
Thanks to the invitation for come speak to you today. Again, also, like Fabian said, for GBI, for the people working with this program, Detroit Speaks. I'm Vicente, and I really kind of feel strange kind of talking about these topics because they're not necessarily topics that I work with generally or specialize in, but I did feel that I guess I was invited here to maybe give a perspective from an international point of view, coming from Latin America, seeing some of the things that I saw in our countries in terms of globalization and how it's affected the working class and the peoples of Latin America more in general throughout maybe these 3 or 4 last decades. For me to speak about globalization, is also impossible to speak out without speaking about this new model that became prevalent in the 70s and was introduced in my country, in Chile, for the first time, which is neoliberalism, which is a system of transformation of capitalism into a new form, which is not really a new form, it's an old form, but it's capitalism recovering its origins and its root. That's why it's neoliberalism. It's the liberalism that was at the origins of capitalism, regaining the main ideas and elements of how it exploited people's lives all around the world. So for me, in that sense, they're tied together. This system of neoliberalism that began to be implemented throughout the world allowed capital corporations to strip a lot of the rights and a lot of the gains that were made by the working class over the course of the 20th century through struggle, struggle in all fields, in the union sphere and outside of it also. Gains in education, healthcare, benefits, wages, the right to unionize, negotiate, and all that was rolled back through these neoliberal policies, and that favored the expansion of capital throughout the world at an unprecedented rate, right? So globalization for me is always, we tend to think of that, in general, in our everyday lives. Oh, we live in a globalized world. We can see things going on around the world. We can travel more freely. We can access different technologies, different cultures. People are moving throughout the world, right? Without talking about the devastating reasons why. But we tend to think, oh, we live in a global society now, right? But for me, globalization isn't something that just happened that way, or it isn't a product of new technologies and modernization. Globalization is a design, right? It's something that was designed by corporate interests, designed by capital in order to improve and expand its rate of profits, right? So the main idea or reason or objective behind globalization for the corporations is to be able to access markets all over the world, markets being these individual countries, right? In this global market that you're talking about, and to be able to invest and extract what they need from those countries and to bring it back and to divert it into more profits for them. So whether it's going into a country and extracting its resources, going into another country and extracting the profit through over exploitation of its workers, capital always is going to find a way to do that. And these barriers that were built up over the 20th century didn't allow that because they had a lot of regulations. It wasn't, possible to do things as freely as they wanted to. They wanted to act with more freedom. And so they eliminated all these barriers, all these regulations and things that were denying them the right to profit more. And so deregulation, decentralization, and everything that was impeding that was swept away in country after country. And this allowed them to divide their production. We know a lot about that in Detroit, obviously, over the years. You divide your production, you take a part of it and send it somewhere else where it's cheaper to produce, send it somewhere else where there's cheaper resources or labor, and that way you increase your rate of profit. And it also produced an effect in countries, which is countries became specialized in certain things also. There's countries who had burgeoning or attempts at projects of national industrialization, and those were swept away too in favor of specializing that country in the extraction of this or that resource. In my country, the example is copper. You can look to all the other countries of Latin America, Africa, Asia, and you can see what they're extracting from each country in terms of the resources that's most needed by capital. So that specialization of these countries, led to them not producing as they were attempting to produce. And obviously the industry and the working classes around the world that were building up power throughout that process started to be fragmented. Just like this production is fragmented, the workers are now fragmented, the workforce is fragmented in different spots, unable to organize and able to see beyond its local reality. And that obviously decreases the power of workers and allows them to depress their conditions, their wages, and obviously to destroy unionization around the world, which is an effect of globalization. A lot of informal work and a lot of more the service type work going around, especially in my country, that's been the main basis of the economy. Financial sector very strong, and basically that I would say that for me is the idea that there's no longer also this vertical integration of companies, corporations that were they're owning every part of the piece of production down from the beginning of the process to the final product, but they spread out, right? They spread that out, and by spreading it out, they also spread out and thin out the power of workers to see and to feel that they can be united in fighting a common exploiter, a common oppressor. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. I want to get to the next question in a second, but I want to get to this issue of fragmentation because I think it's very important. You can see it in front of you, right? If you're from this area and you've seen like Hazel Park, the racetrack is being converted into a warehouse. If you look on 8 Mile Road, subsidized by the state and the city, right? They're converting the old state fairgrounds, into an Amazon warehouse, right? And all of a sudden, we went from having 1 or 2 warehouses or centers in this area, and now there are many of them, right? And that's done specifically to kind of weaken the ability to fight against and organize at those plants. And this is a strategy. I just want to be clear about this because we are the General Baker Institute. That like in 1969, in January, Elrum, Zoe was a part of, who's sitting right here, shut down the only gear and axle plant Chrysler had in the United States. I believe their only other one was in South Africa. But once that was shut down, they couldn't produce cars. And if they kept that strike up, it would have shut down all Chrysler production within a day or two, right? And this is a lesson capital learned, the counter-revolution against kind of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, right? Is to then make these things more mobile, right? Like Vicente was saying, how you divide things and have smaller plants in different countries. So if one is shut down, you're still able to maintain operations. And I mention this because we have to think in a very different way now, how we're going to confront this Goliath, right? That has really spent 50 years consolidating its power by attacking working people through the political spectrum and through the state, but also, through the carceral state, obviously, which was mentioned before, but economically too, where we're fighting against each other for the scraps for survival. And so the question that I have for you guys is, does confronting globalization in the 21st century require a shift in strategy amongst the working class and workers? And how do we go about that? And I'll start with you, John. Jonathan, are you with us?
Oh, I couldn't, I'm sorry. I'll say that the boominess of the microphone kind of makes it a little bit hard to hear some of the words on my end.
Oh, my bad. You question?
It's okay. I've like switched to like viewing the Facebook so I can see the captions too. But could you repeat the question?
Yeah. I'll keep the mic on a stand so that this second. Does confronting globalization in the 21st century require a shift in strategy among the working class? And then what does that look like based on your experience?
Well, for me, I think a lot of the things are actually quite similar to what we've like, what great movements have done in the past. I mean, like recognizing that the power sits with workers first. And so it always has to be in the hands of workers, and workers are the ones who like have to be actually exercising power. That as a classic principle still stands. I think the challenge is that the way that we relate to our sense of community is kind of different today than it was 100 or even just like 50 years ago. And for us trying to build a sense of community where folks like feel those relationships tangibly, that it's a part of their everyday life. What that means for us today, I think is different than it has been in the past, but ultimately the same recipe applies. Workers have to hold power. We have to be able to decide, through radical democracy that we are going to exercise that power. And then we have to get better at exercising it until we're able to change our workplaces, our communities, and the world that we share.
Yes, I think, I think it's already taking place. Tactics are always changing. Strategies can change as well. But if we look back many years ago, for example, on May 1st, 1886, when they had a general strike that demanded an 8-hour day, and the workers were massacred in Chicago. And of course, there were many other struggles that took place, even on an armed level, between coal miners, agricultural workers, and their bosses. In this present period, we do see a change of tactics and even more militancy among working people. Last year, for example, there were a number of strikes that took place in major industries. Kellogg was one that's based here in the state of Michigan, and there were many others. Also, another aspect of the changing tactics and strategies of the proletariat, we also see mass resignations by working people from their jobs for various reasons. We're hopefully coming out of a 2-year pandemic that's been unprecedented over the last century. And as a result of that, there's been a tremendous amount of dislocation in the labor market, in the households that people live in, the communities in which they live in. And this has created a tremendous amount of dislocation. Last year, almost on a monthly basis, several million people were resigning from their jobs in the United States. Bosses were complaining that the government was paying too generous benefits and unemployment, the stimulus checks that people got, the former child tax credits that people got, which now have been all eliminated, because they want us to go back to work for slave wages. And you hear it all the time in the corporate media. So what is happening at Amazon? What is happening with the people who are fighting for $15 minimum wage, and also people who are just walking off the job because they're fed up, with the exploitation and poor treatment. This is a clear indication that the working class is very conscious that it is being exploited in this country. I think the central question is an ideological one. Where does this go? How do working people organize in this period when there is a lot of decentralization of production? Now, but this decentralization of production by capital has also proved to be a disadvantage, particularly over the last 2 years with the pandemic. You have auto production and other forms of even light and heavy industry closing because of supply chain problems, because of microchip shortages, all types of shortages that directly stem from the irrational character of the global capitalist system. So I think this portends much for the ruling class in this country. You look at the legislative approach to the crisis that we've been in over the last 2 years, it's wholly inadequate. At this point, the US Congress, the current administration in Washington is incapable of passing any legislation that would even provide a modicum of assistance to working and poor people in this country, whether it's raising the minimum wage, which they said they were going to do when they got in office in 2021, new voting rights legislation to guarantee universal suffrage in the United States has failed in the US Congress. Just to place a moratorium on evictions while we're in the middle of a pandemic and there's so much dislocation socially in the country, that has also failed. To guarantee reproductive rights for women in this country is under assault, and there's no action by the US Congress in this regard. When we're talking about environmental justice, all the major issues, all the major issues that we've been struggling around, all these years, they have failed to produce. So what we have, this morning we saw the president of Ukraine speaking before the US Congress. So that has become the central issue right now, not how students are going to be able to afford to go to school, how working people are going to be able to obtain housing, quality housing at an affordable rate. That has been taken off the table. And now, obviously, the only solution is more military ventures internationally.
When I look at that question, it's a really deep question, and you can answer it, or you can try to answer it like on a level that's more concrete. But that's a very, very deep question that we're discussing constantly among people who are trying to change this society towards a better society, right? Is there necessary to be a shift in our strategy among the working class? I think straight up and obvious answer would be hell yeah, because we're not winning, right? So the first and obvious answer is yes, we need a shift. What that shift is, what that strategy is, that's where we have to get into the debate of what we mean. Because when we're talking about a strategy, it depends on what sector or what ideas are going to be the ideas that lead, or that working class builds towards its goals of liberation, right? Of freedom from exploitation and of a more just, free society, right? So strategies, there can be a million depending on how you're looking at the problem, right? And what you're trying to do with that problem. The strategy is just basically how you think, or the way in which you think you're going to win, right? And then the other component of that process is, as Conrad was speaking to, tactics, right? The tactics are the actions you take to try to strengthen your power on that way toward the way you think you're going to win. So it depends. It depends what we're looking at and what we're speaking about when we speak of strategy. I think one of the main problems of the working class is, if you take it just as a general, homogenous sector like that, is that we don't always, in our own strategies that are in our interest are not the strategies that dominate our organizations or dominate our movements. They're the strategies that more generally favor the interests that oppose us, right? A lot of times the working class, in a great majority of cases, is co-opted into strategies that don't favor ourselves, that don't favor our liberation, but that are designed to keep us, functioning in a way that's gonna draw us back to the ways that the other class, the ruling class, wants us to function, right? So I think a lot of that has to do with how do you build your own political project, how do you express that as a working class, that, you know, from every little space that we are, right? Every little collective, every little union, every little workplace, every little place of study, every neighborhood, building, you know, towards a common goal that would represent our interests more globally, right? But that's a deep question that, you know, we can get into it maybe as we continue this debate and open it up too. But
All right, well, I'm gonna now segue towards individual discussions. But before we do, I just kind of want to point out, you know, we were saying that you obviously have to change up things, but we also said that there are tactics from the past and strategies from the past that obviously inform kind of, you know, basic worker struggles. And I think, you know, when we're suggesting that people are starting and already embarking on this work, right? I think what Jonathan's doing is a good example of this new wave. And maybe you could talk, as you talk about what you've been doing, talk about kind of like the ways in which you've strategized or the tactics that you've used to kind of deal with some of the issues that you all face with labor as weak as it is in this country. You know, like from absent, you know, just the turnover rate that you have to deal with as organizers really speaks to the quality of organizing you're doing, right? So if you could just tell us about what you've been up to, I'd love to hear a little bit about how today went too.
Yeah, a little bit more detail of what we've been up to.
Yeah, and a little bit about today, how it went today.
Oh yeah. Okay. So today we actually had the first you know, like action, like walkout that is coordinated across like multiple cities, multiple states actually, for Amazon warehouses here in the US, which is a really big deal and a huge milestone for us. You know, so far, Amazonians United has been able to win victories like winning sick leave, paid sick leave, winning paid time off. You know, recently this current action kind of culminated from kind of a larger push with a petition, marches on the boss, demanding basic things like, you know, being able to keep our cell phones on us so that people's kids can get a hold of them if they need, so that we don't end up in the extremely unfortunate situation that our coworkers who were caught in that tornado ended up being in. But like, you know, there's been circumstances where like people have had to have their phones on them because it's life or death, and you know, Amazon trying to keep people's phones away from them, you know, is unacceptable. But there's a host of demands, and you know, we've been able to move from like petition demands to you know, like kind of like lower collective action, marches on the boss, to eventually walkouts. And for us, this was particularly a big success for us because we actually held, you know, we actually were able to, in our warehouse in Woodside, Queens, we're able to hold a strike vote. Actually just a couple days, actually the day before, because the other warehouses were certain that they were going to be taking action. And we're really happy to see that we've had enough like social cohesion that we've been able to vote as a group of workers to strike and, you know, walk out the next day. So you know, most of our progression has kind of been in that fashion. It's not like incredibly different than you know, strategies that people have employed in the past. But we're really happy to see us being able to take advantage of things like, you know, online communities, seeing the way that like social media impacts people's understanding of their role within like the actual actions within the walkouts, kind of how that plays into a broader sense of this cultural shift that that we're undergoing, where more and more people are feeling comfortable investigating, everything from like leftist politics to, telling their boss that they can shove it. Really, we're kind of in this like really, I think, a fascinating exploration of seeing these classic strategies for building workers' power kind of fused with all of these kind of new tools that we have access to. I hope that was clear.
Yeah, I think the tactics are changing. They have to change because the ruling class is very observant, and in most cases, they're much more class conscious than we are. So they spend a lot of time studying the attitudes of workers, the markets under which they have to operate, and also the repressive tactics that are utilized to suppress workers in their efforts to organize and to reject this gross super exploitation that occurs on a daily basis. If you think about the 19th century, for example, in England, where industrial capitalism had its birth, largely as a direct result of the Atlantic slave trade, the capital that was accrued from the Atlantic slave trade. You can read Eric Williams' book, Capitalism and Slavery, and there are other studies on this as well that have come out in recent years. The workers, prior to being organized, many of them had a movement to destroy equipment in the plant, to break machines. So this is a form of resistance that was growing during the 19th century in Britain. Then, of course, later we had the development of trade unions and, of course, the contradictions within the trade union movement as it developed. And then the intervention, of course, of revolutionary movements in the trade union struggle. When you're talking about the anarcho-syndicalists, when you talk about socialists, communists, they all have intervened in these struggles and brought their own ideas about what they thought workers needed to be doing to reverse their level of discrimination. So it's inevitable that we're going to be faced with new challenges. We can see it very clearly now, where prices are rising dramatically in this country. Someone told me the other day it cost them over $100 to fill up their gas tank. Now, there's got to be a pushback at some point against that. Food prices are accelerating as well. So people are going to be coming up with ideas to resist this and demands to resist this. And we don't hear anything coming from the administration in regard to price controls, price freezes, which have been implemented in the past. So it's an ongoing struggle.
He's strayed from the stage. You're going to bring back.
My bad. I was trying to see if we could see something up there. We could either time for the tech. Did you get it, Carolyn? No. Can you show it or no? Yeah, first man.
Share screen. So
If not, it's okay. It's cool. I just wanted to share like a couple of pieces of history from my country recently. Like my country's had a history that some of you may know about a little bit. It had a very, very large, massive, well-organized, very militant workers' movement during the 20th century that began to grow and develop and gain experience. And that expressed itself both in increasing rates of unionization, participation in unions, debate among unions, and tactics and strategies used by unions, and eventually to the large Workers' Central, which in 1953, it was founded on a declaration that was absolutely anti-capitalist, absolutely pro the construction of socialism in our country, right? And that expresses itself in that area, but it also expresses itself in terms of the political parties of my country. There were from the Socialist Party to the Communist Party, different expressions of the working class and its interests, and began to express themselves in politics and began to be increasingly successful in that, until the moment where we got a popular government in 1970, which represented a lot of the interests of our country in terms of being able to nationalize our natural resources, to create a land reform, to further develop and expand the power of workers in the workplace, and to the point of where over the course of 3 years only of that government, which was allowed to exist, it began to give workers the opportunity to control their own workspace. So if you look here, you can see one of the tactics. We're talking about strategies and tactics, right? This is Santiago, the main city of my country. And these areas here are the main arteries of the highways and railways where production and merchandise flowed in our city, right? And so these were areas which were increasingly in those last years of the popular Union government under control of the workers. The workers took over the factories, took over the way in and out of those factories, and began to establish control, and created tension with their own government, because their own government was, hesitant to give them so much power and so much control, because they knew what was at stake. What was at stake was, the backlash from the capitalist and ruling class, which eventually came in 1973 and, made a coup d'etat and overthrew the government of Allende, right? But I wanted you to see that map, and I was watching one of the classes that you had a couple of weeks ago, was talking about the difference, or the combination of the exchange between movements and struggles in the productive sphere, which would be this, and the reproductive sphere, which would be everything outside of that, which affects the working class, right? Our health, our education, the places we live, everything that has to do with everything outside of what's traditionally the working class movement. So if you go to the second map, Carolyn, this is the second expression of popular power, people power during that time, which is, these are the neighborhoods. These are the squatters who were without housing, who were coming from rural to urban migration and had nowhere to live and had, were underemployed or unemployed. So these are the places that began to take over as the workers were taking over control of the factories. They were taking over the unused land of the city, right? To be able to create their neighborhoods and to live, and to move from living in the tent to living in a makeshift house to eventually having government funded housing when they were organizing and demanding it, right? Education, healthcare goes along with that. So, and these spaces, if you go to the third map, began to merge and to create a strategy of working with each other. Because why are they working with each other? Because they're the same people, they're the same family. The worker who's in the factory goes back to his neighborhood, and that time, obviously more male dominated in the factories. But the women were more active in organizing in the neighborhoods, but there was also an expression of unity between those two spaces, which are different social movements, which we think of on different paths, right? But it's one same path. So these are the spaces where they were able to coalesce and form coordinations between the factories and their own neighborhoods, right? So now we're taking control over our neighborhoods, but we're also expressing our power at the point of production, right? That was a strategy in the 1970s, which was so dangerous that it led to the most violent reaction possible by the ruling class, and that was to put an end to this, to ban unions for a period. I had another thing that I noticed there. It's a map of unionization in my country, right? So the unionization going up over the 70s, and then you can see it's. If you find it, fine. But it's the graph where you see the unionization rates and participation in my country going up steadily towards 1973, and then it's the craziest graph because it dropped down to zero for a period of 8 years because unions were prohibited, right? Absolutely, people tortured, assassinated, exiled. So no unions for, and then it goes up, but it goes up, and it never obtained the same rate as it was before. Unions were after that always, a much less rate of unionization and participation. So the lesson for the Chilean people was that was a dangerous thing to do, right? And so to go back to the present lesson in history, which I don't know, what the lessons are from this, we can debate that all day, but 2019, after 30 years, after the dictatorship of neoliberal administration by, kind of center, left-wing or right-wing governments, but the people were living under the conditions of oppression and just basic, precariousness of everyday life, no really right to health care, no right to housing, very low wages, no right to unionization. And all that led up to a boiling point in 2019 where we had a social explosion, right, an uprising, which began over a 4-cent raise in the subway fare. That's all it was. That was the trigger. 4 cents, they raised the subway fare, and who went out to the streets? One of the movements that had been steadily increasing over a 10-15-year period, gaining experience, gaining leadership, and knowing how to mobilize, but also knowing how to organize and how to, at each small spot where they were, to coordinate, right? And that was the student movement, right? Student movement, not only of college students, but mainly and also of high school students. The high school students were the ones who set it off. They set it off how? The tactic was, let's disobey this 4 cent raise. We're just gonna go and jump the turnstiles. Basically, that was it. Let's jump the turnstiles, let's ride the subway for free. That led to this reaction, which was a crazy overreaction by the government of you repressing them, hitting them, beating them up, putting them in prison. High school kids, right? High school kids, dragging them off. That was on the news, and the people that saw it on the news and the working class of my country was like, no, it's too much. 30 years of this, it's too much. This is the last straw. And basically it led to a rebellion on the 18th and 19th of October, 2019, where Chile was burning, right? Burning down. They were just, we're burning the buses, we're burning the subway. We're not gonna, this has to stop. Neoliberalism has to stop. And that's not just an explosion that happened overnight. It's an explosion that was the birth of that student movement, but also the birth of other movements that defended working class interests from a position of weakness of the union movement. For example, the main pillar, one of the main things that the dictatorship did to take away workers' rights was it privatized absolutely the pension system. So over 10, 15 years before this social uprising, the pension system was one of the things where people started to organize around and led to massive mobilizations, millions of people on the street. With the participation of some sectors of the working, of the labor movement, professors, healthcare, public sector workers, and some other organized sectors, but mainly just also an expression of social, outrage at the low pensions that this privatized system was producing. So that was one of the main demands that also was part of this, Another important movement in this explosion, feminism, right? The feminist movement gaining consciousness, gaining awareness, gaining an idea of its own power, and expressing itself also in the hundreds of thousands, in the millions even, to the point where, I don't know, yesterday we have, a very large vote in my country to finally gain sexual reproductive rights for women, which was an unheard of thing in a very Catholic, very traditional conservative country for many, many years. So those types of movements coalescing with working class interests and changing their tactics and also at some point leading to a social and political crisis were what allowed our country to move forward in a very difficult way with a lot of obstacles, a lot of challenges, but also using the tactics you were speaking, the tactics from the past, mobilization on the street, organizing in different spaces, and also, and ultimately also direct confrontation with the state, because one of the things that allowed this stalemate to move forward was the people didn't back down. They put a military curfew on us, we didn't back down. We're like, we're not going home, we're staying out up late after 10, whatever it is. We're going back on the street the next day and the next day. And then we just interrupted the whole normalcy of the country for 2 months on end. The whole normalcy of the country was that people didn't go to work. It was like, you got out of work at like 12 and went to the protest, and that was, the half of your day went by in that. And so after all that, they reached a point where, despite all that, and I'll finish here, despite all that, there was no possibility for this working class movement to have a solution or a resolution that was led by an organization of the working class, because that organization of the working class had been destroyed over 30 years. And that's the one thing we haven't been able to rebuild. There's no political party or political movement that was at that moment of crisis where the government was on its, on the ropes, you could say, able to take control of that and say, okay, this is the new project for society we want. What we do have is kind of a negotiated, exit to that crisis, which is a convention that's going to change our constitution. And that's all in dispute. And it's very favorable to some of our interests, but it's also a space where we have to, still play by the rules of, democracy and institutions and the things that, the powers that rule there that have, kind of set the limits for what people could do, and what people could not do. But I guess that's what I wanted to contribute, just a little bit of history to show how, unions and social movements can work together. When one of them is strong and the other is, not as strong. But I think the main goal is to build up that strength to be able to represent a political project that represents the interests of the working class and not just social explosions which come and go and which cannot win really if they don't have the power to stop the violence of the state and the violence of the ruling class, which is tremendous and enormous. So that's something we have to obviously work decades or maybe before, but it's an objective that I don't think we can ever stop having, because we cannot forget that when they want to, they will destroy your efforts at reform. If they have to burn everything to the ground, to do it.
We can make the maps available to people online. Anyone want to comment or respond to anything that was said? Anyone on the panel want to jump in or add something that maybe sparked your interest while you were listening? Oh, we'll take a question.
Well, I really didn't have one here.
Yeah, please. In the mic, if you would.
Yes.
I should follow my own rule.
Just talk. Just talk.
Just talk.
Okay. Well, first I want to say that's a killing fro you got there, young man. I love
He says you got a beautiful fro.
that.
Oscar Gamble-ish.
Yeah. Yeah, well, what came to mind when you guys were talking to me is workers going into the future, workers are going to need to reimagine what work is. I mean, we can be fighting a fight that gets us nowhere. The idea of work needs to be thought about more and changed. And because the future, right now the capitalists got us in a box. We do this and we don't get out of that box. And we're not growing mentally. I think work and education as well should be something that uplifts and changes our way of thinking, helps us grow, our mental state of mind grow. So, and we're not there yet. And I think that's where one of the things that we need to start thinking about is what is the future of labor? Not within the framework of a union or like that, but what exactly should we be working on? Like an example, it's like the factories or the corporations are coming out with ideas of electric cars or flying cars or self-driving cars. Why the hell we need cars anyway? What about mass transportation? Those are the kind of things I'm talking about. Reimagining what we should be thinking about for the future. Thank you.
My name is Donald Roberts, and I was part of the drone movement, Revolutionary Black Workers. And I stepped away in 72, 73 to gain some more skills. And in 73, I had a dishwashing job on Woodward Greenleaf, and it got bought up from under me as soon as I got promoted from dishwashing to somewhere else. So then I went to Albedo's car wash on Mack and the Boulevard. And this was a known car wash. All the ones who weren't criminals were looking to be criminals. And anyway, Albedo come in there and told me one day after I had been working there a couple of months, he says, Donald, he didn't say it in these words, but paraphrasing, I gotta let you go. And that's when I understood what a blackball was. Moving right along up to today's term, I got out of prison in 2000, and so around 2008, this was in Ann Arbor, Michigan, I decided to run for sheriff. And so I came to Detroit and preferred Virginia Baker for about 3 days. And so they had all kinds of newspaper articles in the Ann Arbor paper about me. And so when I got back to Ann Arbor, I got arrested. So I was really outraged about that. And so I got to moving around, going to different little things. And so I did a survey, and nobody wanted the job of sheriff for the Great Lakes. And so I took that job. I just appointed myself as the sheriff of the Great Lakes. And sat down on line 5 was my biggest involvement in something big, in the sense that going back to what you were saying, I'm thinking about new ways. If there's any kind of accident, which is bound to happen, up there at line 5 at the bridge, all the Great Lakes is gone. All the fresh water in this area. Matter of fact, the Great Lakes is one of 10 spots on the planet Earth with the biggest body of fresh water. So as we speak, the whole western part of the United States is trying to get at Great Lakes water. Basically, we are shark bait. But moving right along, one of the things that's been missing from this discussion, I think is kind of important, is the industrial age era, however you want to say it, is in decay. The digital age is upon us. This is a brand new epic in the history of humanity. That's part of what you were saying about looking at different ways of art. And that right there is crucial, because the struggle in Ukraine is between the decay of industrial capital and, for want of a better term, the colonial and neo-colonial world getting with the digital age. And so it's a twisted, mangled situation. And I just want to share that with y'all.
Thank you. Anyone else have a question? Zoe, would you step up to the mic if you do? Yeah. Oh, yeah. After Zoe. Sorry.
My name is Alonzo Chandler. I'm one of the overgrown people also. But I just want to basically give you all some food for thought, because I don't have answers. But I really would like to hear from you young people about what they have said and what you think you need in order to move forward. Because these people are thinking all the time. They pay think tanks, people in think tanks, to plot strategy for them. And, you know, it's sort of like going back in terms of tactics and what you need to do. That's very important. It's going to be different in your era, as Abdul was saying. You're living in a whole different era. And just let me give you an example. Just for example, labor is what brings all of everything alive in the capitalist system. We know that. Everybody knows that. But guess what? In the robotic and electronic era, labor and value is not the same anymore. It changes. I always give an example to have people understand something, because I try to explain things as simple as possible. If you go to the bar and have a drink, you tip the waitress. If you go to the finance company and ask for a house loan and they give you a 20-year house loan, you pay the mortgage. A robot does not go to the bar and tip the waitress. A robot doesn't go over to the loan company and ask for, so a robot can't create value. Only people can. A robot can create things. It can produce an abundance of all kinds, but it can't create value. And since it can't create value, your wages drop. I'm only saying that to give you some food for thought. In our era, one of the things that was different then and now is that, for example, I'm gonna take the Black experience, and it can be, it can be spread out. We're taking the Black experience. We had a bunch of organizations, not necessarily revolutionary, but we had a bunch of organizations. We had AdCom that was in this area here. We had organizations on the east side. We had organizations on the southwest side. You already had built-in people. When something happened, you could call someone and a group could be formed in order to do something. Without getting too far out there, my point is you must be able to make demands, specific demands. As he was talking about in Chile, the demand, for example, of housing or the demand for transportation, 4 cents. They charge 4 cents more. They're charging you $1 and something more for gas and nobody do anything about it. You understand what I'm saying? When I look back, and anybody can debate this, when I look back at the things we did, one of the things we were able to do because of what I said about all these organizations that also tied into the working class, because all of these working people lived in a neighborhood. We actually had neighborhoods. That doesn't hardly exist anymore. But the point is, what we did basically is we infiltrated the UAW. And we infiltrated all of those locals. And we ran our own people. And we began to make specific demands that we could get. And I don't want to scare you all, but listen, your generation and the ones behind you, if you don't get it done, it's not going to get done. Because they're so far ahead at this point. If you don't get it done and the people right behind you, you're gonna be non-existent. Your children, your grandchildren are gonna be wiped out because they don't care about anybody anymore. They only need a certain amount of people to run these machines. And that gets to another thing, that one of the themes that these sessions have brought about is that I like to say the roots of the present are buried in the past. And what I mean by that is simply this: if you work for a living for somebody and you get a paycheck, I don't give a damn if you're a professor at a college. They are running these colleges like little corporations now. You understand what I'm saying? They're not running, even the public college, they're not running public colleges for the public. Wayne State got so much, almost in the cup. Wayne State got so much stuff over there in that area, it's not funny. They're being run like a corporation. They don't give a damn about you. They're only going to need a certain amount of people to do things. And one of the things, if you notice, if you've been here, is that you've got to understand that the definition of work and working class has changed. We're pretty much all in this together now. Regardless of whether you're black, white, or whether you going to work with a white shirt on and a suit, we're pretty much, if you live in a paycheck, you're a working person. In a broad sense. And so, and in that sense, you have to develop some tactics. You have to ask yourself, what is it that we need to do to bring ourselves together? You need to sit down. What kind of tactics do you need to do? But you don't have the big unions that we had. You don't have the same organizations that we had. And one of the things you might have to do, and this is part of the voter suppression thing, not just about suppressing the black vote and the Hispanic vote. It's about you're not running for anything. They don't want you to run for public office and start creating your own laws. They don't want that. I'm gonna say one example, and I'm gonna shut it down. Think about this just for a minute. They've been making cars since the early 1900s. This is 2021. So the gas and oil companies have made $1.19 billion this year, $1.19 billion. Soon as something happens, they raise gas prices on us. What if you had enough people in place to say, oh, you can't do that? You have to bite the bullet. Why are you asking us to bite the bullet? You bite the bullet. That's all I want to say.
Well, I mean, you can swear, I just want to make that clear. It's all right. Feel free. Thank you. Anyone else? You got a question in the back? Let you go. I apologize for missing you before.
I'm kind of like rethinking it based on what he said, but it's just like a lot that I've been thinking about these past couple of weeks. During my spring break, my dad, he works from home now, so he's at home and the conference with his boss. And my dad is kind of close, so he'll be retiring like 5 to 10 years. But he was mentioning to his boss, like, especially the digital age, stuff like that, like a lot of these things, a lot of these like positions are like as we mentioned earlier, he was saying like once it comes down to where they're just disposing people, like they're like disposable, like they trash them, stuff like that. I couldn't like necessarily understand what his boss was saying, but it just made me think about like when we talk about like the labor unions and like what we should be fighting for, it's like since we're coming to like the age of like technology, like the digital era, I kind of get to a point where it's like how much you want to try to push for like certain demands before they say like, oh, you're gonna be running, you're gonna be like, say like you're not gonna need people like physical people that these places more important to like demand these things. So it's like they don't really care. So it's like how much do you try to push, how much do you try to sit back, or if you need to sit back in the first place before you think about like, you know, my job could like be taken over by machines or like not taken over, but like, you know, I could be replaced in the age of technology. So like, should I add to this? Should I demand for that? This is like that. And so, I don't know, like, I feel like there's a need to do so because it's just like, we're just like, there's like no wage increase. Like we're still fighting for wage increases, but it's like costs of living are increasing itself. So it's like, where do you, like, you guys understand what I'm saying? Like, where do you like make that fight? And how do you go about doing that? It's something I've like been thinking about.
Okay, Jonathan, just so you can hear, she was talking about, was your father you were referring to?
Yeah, he works at Ford.
Works at Ford Motor Company, and he was lamenting the fact about automation, essentially, about being replaced by robotics. And the conundrum that puts workers in who are dependent upon a check. Do they fight in opposition to that, or do they kind of like sit back in hopes that, you know, not fighting will somehow defray them being replaced by, you know, machines and things of that nature? Now, I would just argue to you before I turn this one over is that they're going to go to automation as soon as it becomes more profitable to them. So it behooves you to fight because it's coming anyway. And you don't want to react. You want to be proactive, knowing that that's going to come. Because like we were saying, and Vicente was saying before about in Chile, you know, there's 30 years of struggle that animated kind of the rebellion in Chile, right? You have to fight to win. And you don't win by fighting, but waiting to the last minute to fight. I think that's very important, but I'll open up the floor to anyone else that wants to respond.
Yeah.
I think you wanted to.
Go ahead.
Jonathan.
Yeah, oh, Jonathan, go ahead.
Then we'll go.
So like I think that the concern around automation is I think that concern is real. I think that there's a very clear difference between the way that automation and how like increasing like implementation of artificial intelligence as a way to like replace workers. I think it significantly changes the calculus of what our movements need to look like. You know, one of the things that I learned early on within like activist like spaces, and kind of like trying to figure out the different ways that colonialism has worked in the past, is the concern over Black people in the Americas was over labor, right? Over like extracting the value that Black bodies could create. And the colonialism targeted at like Native Americans was more balanced towards, you know, just the land, right? That like where indigenous peoples weren't like needed, and you know, that created these very different forms that colonialism took, right? We got the creation of chattel slavery, you know, as a form of like, you know, political violence executed on Black peoples, and we got just like, you know, mass like genocide targeted towards indigenous peoples. And so I think that we've seen these relationships happen before. And when people aren't valued for their labor, when there is like not a very clear extractive value that can be like placed on them, then there's a lot more interest in them just being completely disposed. And I think that that's like a really scary position for us to be in, right on the cusp of like, you know, artificial intelligence making its way into affecting like labor calculus. So yeah, I think it's like a huge concern. If we as working people don't get our act together fast, we are not going to have any power in deciding what happens with us. And I could see a future that is just a really bad time for us. So I encourage everybody to be engaged in projects that actually help us develop the ability to exercise power, because we actually have to get really, really good at deciding together as a group what the plan is, what we're going to do, and then actually exercising that power. If we don't develop the ability to be fearless when we are in like what is really like terrifying, scary situations, if we can't figure out how to do that now, it's going to be a lot harder in the future. You know, the battle now is like being afraid of being fired or not, you know, whereas like the battle in the future is going to be like it can be one that gives us a different sense of our mortality. So yeah, I agree, it's like a huge concern, and I think that should be a part of our calculus in terms of how we see the future of our movements moving.
Thank you. Something?
No, I'm just, yeah, I was actually going to ask a question for John too, but I think it's great that you ended on that, because that's kind of part of what I was wondering also, that the issue of fear, you know, the issue of fear is one of the most powerful things that impedes us from coming together and overcoming those barriers. And I would maybe a little bit disagree and put a different perspective on one of the things you said right at the end. I think when you really have nothing to lose, you do become fearless, and I've seen that, you know, in history, and I've seen that on the streets. You know, when we tend to be more subjected or submitted to our fear is when we, you know, we're thinking that we have something to lose here, that, you know, if we do this, or if we speak up on that, you know, we might lose the little privileges or the little possibilities of living our life like we want, that we have, right? So yeah, I agree, we have to prepare for those moments and chip away at the fear, you know, and I think that's the work of union organizing, is a lot of chipping away at fear, which is one of the, you know, the evil things that prevents us from coming together. But also I think individualism, you know, is a very big issue in this country. So chipping away at fear and individualism, my question kind of for you was like, you know, how beyond those two factors, you know, which are our great enemies in the workplace and in any struggle really, how have you been able to transmit the tremendous power that you have as Amazon workers today also? Because in one sense, you're very, you're very restricted in a lot of things you can do. But at the same time, the Amazon workforce, I would say, is one of the most powerful in this country if one day decided to shut that shit down, right? I mean, it literally is like part of the lifeblood of the economy here, right? So how do you create that sense of we got this? We have a little bit of power that we can exercise, and using the lessons of the labor movement, using the lessons of the history of how we won things. I just wanted to really brief because I get kind of nervous when I have a time restriction. So I didn't mention one of the most important parts of what I was trying to say in that narration of the story, which ties back to the original maps. After this explosion of social violence and unrest on the 18th and 19th of October, we developed a series of weeks and week in and week out of social struggle on the streets. The police came out. They hit us hard. A lot of people lost their lives. A lot of people lost their eyes. But the people were fighting back and pushing back, and these social movements were regrouping and trying to see how we could take advantage of this opportunity. And all that regrouping and all those discussions led to a lot of assemblies, a lot of work, a lot of how do we move forward? How do we take control of this thing? Or how do we give the final coup to this government? And all that led up to a general strike throughout the whole country on November 12th, 2.5 some weeks after the initial unrest, right? And that general strike was twofold, just like the maps I showed. It was partly the most combative, the most militant unions saying we're going to shut this, the workplace down, but also just from the social movements and from the territorial level, we're going to cut, the main highways off. We're going to shut down the center of the city, and we're going to do whatever we can do to make this, sabotage whatever's necessary to make this shutdown be effective. Because general strike is not effective unless nobody's working, and it doesn't hurt the economy and scare the people who are worried about the, stability in this other country unless you're really shutting it down, right? So that strike on November 12th was super effective. And one of the most, I think, striking things to me about its effectiveness was we shut down the ports in Chile. The dock workers at the ports controlling the flow of merchandise shut down anything going in and out of Chile. And we're also able to achieve coordination internationally and solidarity with some of the people here in the United States on the West Coast, who expressed their, we're with Chile, and we're not going to let anything that's going to Chile go to Chile. So they shut that part of their port down, at least for a couple hours. So that led to the really big scare of the ruling class. And 3 days later, on the 15th of November, they had, okay, we'll give up the Constitution. That strike was so powerful that they said we're going to give up Pinochet's Constitution, which was the neoliberal Constitution, and we'll accept a process of change. That process is in dispute. There's a lot of forces acting there, what we can do, what we can't do. But what I was, and just to wrap that part out, that power expressed on that one day, which is, those are the days in history which you look towards as the milestones in history, allowed us to have the new scenario we have today. So how do you work to chip away at that fear in individualism? How do you work to tell people and to build up that sense of confidence that even though you can't do it today, there's little things that you can do that could be, little gains today, but there's a sense of the power that the working class has within, specifically your work.
Yeah. So like it's like, I think it's really cool how basically we're always like, cycling back to these like core like principles, like, hey, how do we like help everybody feel courageous in the face of capitalist exploitation and oppression, and how do we build this sense of like collective identity? I think that probably, because people are generally still the same now, even if we have vastly different tools and situations that we're placed in, chipping away at fear is very similar to the way that it's always been, and building a sense of collective identity is still the same for us. Like building a sense of collective identity so that people can feel a sense of like class protagonism, that they are affecting the change, like the course of history through their behavior, like their decisions to talk to their coworkers in between breaks, to convince them to walk out with them, that has historical implications. I think that's like really big. It like places people it more firmly places people in a sense of their identity. Like it gives them a sense of like purpose and placement within history. For like, you know, some of us who have like had family that have engaged in labor struggles, it develops a sense for like how we connect to our families, how we like really like connect to our ancestors. And it also like brings that context into the workplace as well. And that can kind of like, you know, extend that sense of like brotherhood and sisterhood amongst like coworkers. And I think that like building on that, we can develop a stronger sense of like collective identity, that we exist now in this time, and our behavior right now will shape, you know, will shape the future. And I think like having that kind of context for your life is I think it's stirring in a way that a lot of things aren't. I think that it's really easy to kind of you know, like when you're stowing a box, you know, 330 times per hour, and you're like, you know, like 11 hours of your existence might just be like following the lights, you know. It can be like extremely alienating. Like you know, it can divide you from like a sense of purpose, and a certain like a placement with like in like what your life is, what it means, you know. But I think that through the way that we can organize, we can provide a lot of those things. We can like bring that context into people's lives. And I think that that can really easily result in a lot more courage for people to fight in ways that they haven't necessarily experienced before. So that's what we're going to do. What you said about I just wanted to say what you mentioned earlier about connecting like the labor struggles to like the community struggles really resonates with me, because like, you know, for us that's like a really big thing that we like see for our future. Not that we are executing power in a big way that kind of really like I guess like typifies maybe that, but like you know, for us, you know, Amazon places its warehouses where you know, in close, or like in close proximity, or in the centers of like colonized peoples in their communities, right, to tap into that as like a labor pool, right? And for us, we can see like the stronger that we are in our work, in our warehouses as a workforce, the greater possibility we have for branching that struggle out into people's housing. You know, we have people who live in public housing in Queensbridge, the largest public housing development in our hemisphere. You know, we have the potential to build our movements out in those ways in which they have been before, while like leveraging all of the tools that we have in this day and age. So yeah, that's where our minds are at.
We have a question. So I'll go first. The next question from
my question was about, I remember somebody mentioning like the powerlessness of like, the U.S. legislature, and we've been talking about Amazon worker unions, and we talked a little bit about the digital age and how it affects things. And I think that really gives more power to more power to information and misuse of information. And one thing I was wondering is, how do we fight against these like actors that use information to hurt us? Like, for instance, we're talking about Ukraine, like Russia meddled in our elections in 2016. And because of that is partly responsible to the deadlock in Congress due to all these right-wing electors that got elected through misinformation. And Amazon has employed, I guess, influencers to pretend that working at Amazon is great and everything's just fine. How do we fight against this, especially as we move further into the digital age?
I've done a lot of talking, so if one of the other panelists wants to mention, I mean, I have thoughts, but you know, I'd love to hear the other panelists' thoughts.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the point about automation in the capitalist system. It's not new. I mean, the system of production has been evolving for decades and decades. Even in the early 1970s, late 1960s, at one of the Chrysler plants, instead of using the term automation, they used the term niggermation, meaning at that time, you had a lot of young African Americans working in the auto industry, and they were subjected to consistent speed ups in the production process. And I believe that if you look at the theory of surplus value, for example, that Marx developed in the 1850s, you know, his writings on wage, labor, and capital, workers are still generating surplus value, even in the 21st century. That's why they have low wages. That's why today we have labor shortages in certain sectors of the economy. Also in the service sectors of the economy, they're taking on techniques which are similar to mass production. Look at Amazon, for example. The workers there are subjected to speed ups, long hours, without adequate compensation for their labor. The fact that you can order a book and receive it in a day and a half indicates that there's a disciplined labor force that is behind them. Who builds the robots? The robots don't build themselves. Who develops the software for artificial intelligence? It's us that develop it. It's workers that develop it. So simply because the working class today is different than it was 50 or 60 years ago, does not mean it does not exist. It has different manifestations. We talked about Amazon. We can talk about driving for Uber or Lyft or DoorDash. So you go downtown now for the last year and a half since they tried to reopen. A lot of the restaurants close at 3 or 4 o'clock in the day because they don't have workers to cook and to wait tables and to clean. The area where I live, I see a lot of job employees wanted. There's not lines of people standing outside the applications or knocking down the door to get a job. People are resigning from jobs in this country over the last over recent period. So I think it's a big shift in production and also the character of the working class, which is international as well. Because a lot of the production that we've been seeing in this period is international. And the fact that we do have digital technology, we do have artificial intelligence has allowed corporations and institutions to stay open over the last 2 years because people can work from home. And that has been able to maintain a degree of production and the delivery of services. So I just wanted to give it to you.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said there. And going back to the question that you asked, that's more up my alley because I'm a rapper. I do hip hop. I believe in the power of the word and message and communication and culture. So I think what you touched on is one of the gigantic enemies out. Obviously, we have also is the power of the media historically, and today the power of social media too, which is not neutral. We all know that. You know, it has influences and interests behind it, and it operates in a certain way for a reason also. You know. So I think we got tremendous challenges, old challenges and new challenges around that. And I think one of the ways is, you know, to keep that fight going and to understand its importance, like you know, you mentioned in here, it brings up the issue that's important, right? We need to create our own content. We need to create our own culture. We need to create our own art, and we need to have that be different and substantially from what we're competing against. Not only, you know, in the content itself, but also in the form and the way we express it. You know, bringing back some of the old things that we need as human beings, you know, and getting away from the alienation that is produced by a lot of the media. But also just combating the narratives that they throw out. You know, this is very difficult. We know that, especially in the context like over the last couple of weeks, how difficult it is to, you know, to analyze a situation when it's attained, you know, national and international attention, and to analyze that and see what's the historical context there, and then, you know, what's really going on, and how does imperialism and history of this country play a part in that, right? And what the new, you know, the new challenges are internationally for alternatives to this system, right? So I think, yeah, I think we all have to, and obviously you as students, you know, have a role there too, you know, research, you know, education, they're all battlefields, right? So everybody has their own, you know, position in the struggle for a better society, you know, for a better way of life. And I think every part of that, every piece of that is important, you know, just as important as the struggle of a workplace like Amazon or a movement on the streets like I was starting in Chile, just as important as that is creating and doing things in a different way in terms of communicating what we can communicate and winning the war for really informed, educated citizens and human beings, right? And I'll just say to end that, infórmate antes que te formate, la TV, lee y aprende de la calle también. Al rico le conviene mantenerte ignorante y ocultar información con la función de esclavizarte.
Was the November 2020 general strike in Chile the catalyst for the constitutional?
Was the November 2020 general strike in Chile the catalyst for the constitutional reform? From YouTube.
It was the direct, I think, direct cause and catalyst, because on the 15th of November, 3 days later, we had an agreement to change the Constitution. In that sense, it was, yeah, the direct catalyst. Yeah, that definitely opened a new process, but also that was the way that, you know, they closed that process and started shutting down the protest, which was much more ambitious. So, for example, the protest had a lot to do with, we don't want this pension system, we want to change this pension system, we want better pensions, or, you know, things like, you know, the wages, you know, the minimum wage, things that were really affecting people's pockets at that time. And those things were kind of put to the side and said, okay, we'll wait and we'll do these things in the new constitution, which is much more profound, you know, it's much more, you know, it has more transcendence over time, you know, but it was a dual thing where that general strike scared the shit out of them to where they were like, okay, we got to concede something. What can we concede? Let's concede this, but let's keep it all within the margins of democracy and the institutional framework that we already have. And the 2/3 was a big issue. You know, 2/3 of the vote is necessary to change anything. So that was not struck down because, you know, and ultimately that also saved the government that was on the ropes. Like I said, that government could have been overthrown, and it wasn't because, you know, they gave something. So yes, direct catalyst was.
Craig. Yes, we have time for one more question, Craig. It better be good.
It's a question for Jonathan. A few weeks ago, we had a Teamsters for Democratic Union member talk about, you know, organizing the Teamsters. And I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole of that, but my question is, for folks at Amazon who are actively organizing, such as yourself, the possibility, how do people think about the possibilities of the Teamsters Union in some form or another becoming more involved in or helping to organize Amazon workers? What is your sense of that? Are people talking about it? Are people excited? Are they afraid? Are they, you know, what are people talking about regarding the possibility of Teamsters getting more involved?
Well, so like, I mean, so I work in the Amazon warehouse that is in the smack dab middle of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's congressional district. And like the vast majority of my coworkers have never heard of her. Like they don't know, like they know that unions are a thing and they might have been a part of a union, but most of them, if they have ever worked in a unionized place, they don't remember the name of the union or who they are. And like, they don't know who the Teamsters are, right? And then there's those of us who have been more exposed to like the activist space, you know, we're like familiar, you know, just like some of us who've become more familiar with like ideas like, you know, not just unionism, but like, you know, we know like the, you know, we know that a lot of the history of unions within the US and, you know, have opinions on things like business unionism and, you know, are, I don't know, taken lines of various caucuses within DSA or whatever other thing that like places us in like these different groups. Like for me, like Amazonians United does not have like an official line that it is that is bound to as like a national. You know, like for us, we're like happy to receive like support from everybody in the labor movement, and you know, we've like turned out to support like other people's actions, including the Teamsters. For me, like personally, I mean, the Teamsters are proud to have police in their union. You know, like police unions, like you know, that like directly results in Black Death in the US. You know, it enables like you know, police to kill Black people with impunity, and I don't really see how that is compatible with my interests. And I think that there's like certain like political conflicts that like have to be confronted before like that like those relationships can be like really truthfully healthy, you know. But I'm looking forward to seeing the way that people's understanding of these conflicts evolves with time, and you know, hopefully practicing that revolutionary patience is going to pay off in all of us like sharing a similar perspective on like these different power structures within our society.
Wonderful. I think we're just about out of time. I want to thank everybody that came here today. I want to jump in particularly. You had a very busy day, I'm sure. Thank you for joining us. We do appreciate it. All of you who came out here today, our panelists as well, thank you. I learned a great deal today. And I'll just close with kind of something that I think reflects on the last question and that we've been coming back to throughout the series. And that is, you know, solidarity has to be unconditional. Right? No strings attached, not just at the workplace, it's 24/7, it's not 8 hours a day, right? And I think that relates to kind of your comments about your relationship with Teamsters or potential business unions. I think that also relates to kind of how we have to think about, like, you know, how we're going to play, right? This has to be beyond the boundary of just your workplace. It has to be a part of our daily lives. It's going to take time, let's be clear. If you just said revolutionary patience, but the objective is for all of us to identify with each other and each other's struggles so we can, you know, bring that solidarity when need be and receive it when need be. So thank you all, and I'll see you next week. You can do the preview.
So thank you again. Yeah, this was awesome. Speakers were awesome. Next week, we're going to have public sector workers against austerity. We're going to have a Detroit bus driver. We're going to have a high school teacher from Detroit. We're going to have a former postal worker. And we are also going to have a university staff person from Wayne State. So we're going to be talking about austerity. What is austerity and how public sector unions and public sector workers have been pushing back, not just in the last few years, but a very long time against austerity. We'll talk about that next week. So thanks again, everybody.
Thank you, John.
So you got the bus, the folks going on the bus, you probably have about 8 or 9 minutes before you have to go out there if you want to chat for a minute before we go. Grab some more food too, yeah.